My name's Jennifer Cook. I direct the Africa Program here at CSIS, which is a bipartisan think tank covering all regions of the world and with thematic offices as well, looking at energy, security, health, development, and so forth. Today marks the launch of a new series that the Africa Program has organized. We're calling it Spotlight on Africa. Each quarter taking an in-depth look at political and economic dynamics within some of the continent's leading economies. We feel there's a tendency in Washington to look at much of Africa through a particular prism, either of development or trade or health. And what we wanted to do with this series is really look at these countries on their own terms. What is the political economy within them? What are the forces at play that shape outcomes in health, in development, and so forth? But to bring experts from the country to talk about those dynamics. So we're really delighted to be launching this, and particularly to be launching it with a session on South Africa. South Africa doesn't really get the kind of debate and discussion here in Washington policy circles that I think it warrants as such an important player on the continent and also such an important partner of the United States. And it is a tremendously interesting and important moment for South Africa as well. You know, I think we recognize kind of the vibrancy of South Africa, politically engaged citizenry, vocal citizens, and kind of this inspiring history of transformation. But there are a lot of challenges that South Africa is facing now going forward. We look at the kind of the political shifts and the shifts in voting patterns, the enduring divides between the haves and the have-nots, the problems in education, in health service delivery, and so forth. So we recognize there are a lot of concrete gains being made, but at the same time, expectations have been kind of racing ahead, and it's not enough, not soon enough for many South Africans. So today we're going to get into some of these discussions on kind of the forces at play that are shaping these political events and economic events and how those two domains intersect and shape each other. To start off, though, we are really delighted to have U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, Patrick Gaspard. Ambassador Gaspard became ambassador in the summer of 2013, so he's now in his third year. He was previously an executive director of the Democratic National Committee, an advisor in the Obama White House. He spent many years working for the Healthcare Workers Labor Union and with SEIU, so kind of has insights into South Africa coming from a particular angle there that I think are important. In all the engagements that I've heard Ambassador Gaspard in South Africa, in the speeches and the coverage, what you get is, I think, a real enthusiasm for the country, for the job, and for the U.S.-South African relationship. And it's not always been an easy relationship. We know that, and maybe we'll hear a little bit about that today. But it's an important one, it's a strong one, and it's one that has multiple dimensions, whether it's trade and investment, whether it's education, whether it's health and health research, or whether it's civil society. And so, Ambassador Gaspard, welcome, and we're looking forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Jennifer. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to everyone who's here in this room and to those who are watching on the live stream. Jennifer put a tremendous amount of pressure on me today when she told me that this was the inauguration of what's intended to be a long and in-depth look across the African continent, and the mere fact that she termed this a keynote just seems to me to add an air of profundity that you will not find any evidence of in my remarks this morning. I can assure you of that. But it really is quite an honor and a pleasure to be here to see many, many friends in this audience, and to be amongst the distinguished panelists who you'll hear from a little bit later today. It's exciting to be with individuals who are not only experts across a range of fields, but who care deeply about a country and a region to which I have a passionate and long-standing affinity. A note of appreciation to CSIS for your special focus on Africa, and particularly your elevation of South Africa at this critical juncture. To put it simply, South Africa matters. It matters to the continent and to the world. It matters to those of us who understand that the growth in GDP and opportunity that we all celebrate across sub-Saharan Africa can only be sustained if South Africa progresses, as it's responsible for almost a quarter of that GDP and for significant amounts of foreign direct investment in the region. But it also and most especially matters to all of us who have a fealty for justice and equality on this spinning globe. South Africa will long occupy a special space in our political imaginations, with a history that compels us to expand our moral horizons. But this great experiment will collapse under the weight of its own myths if economic malaise deepens. It is this tension that acts as our urgent convener here this morning. When I consider the scholarship of your panelists, Jennifer, I have to say that I feel like the opening act for Beyonce. There's little that I could add to the fireworks, and I recognize that this crowd didn't show up for my feeble voice, but rather for their expertise. My only ambition is to hopefully provide a little bit of a helpful frame before the showstoppers arrive on stage, and perhaps I'll manage to give you a sense of what we see as some of the challenges and opportunities in our bilateral relationship, and I might even manage to sound one or two provocative notes if I'm allowed. So your agenda projects an examination of South Africa's political and economic landscape. But to those, I'd like to add the business of transformation. It's really impossible to have a proper accounting of politics and finance in South Africa without an interrogation of the ongoing attempts to help integrate the masses of previously disadvantaged individuals. Electoral outcomes and the crisis in unemployment must always be read with a special appreciation of that foundational challenge. That seems so incredibly obvious to me when I say it, but I find too many instances where that isn't factored into the analysis. You can't really have a proper conversation about economic trends in South Africa and where the politics are headed if you don't appreciate that over the last few years, the percentage of black CEOs in top firms in South Africa has gone from 15% down to 10%, and across the board, if you look at the top 40 companies in the country, and you look at the 350 individuals who are part of executive management of those top 40 companies, less than 19% of them are black South Africans. You really have to understand what that means in an economy where 75% of the economically active people in the country are black, but they have that kind of paucity of representation at the corporate boardroom, and for too many young South Africans who are demonstrating and protesting now while still being aspirants, it's difficult for them to step back and not think that there may have been a political transformation in 1994, but not a proper economic one that really inserts them into the mainstream of the economy. So that's the existential crisis that persists in South Africa. And if we don't get at that, then we're not really talking about this country in its infinite dimension. So, quote, "It becomes more necessary to see the truth as it is if you realize that the only vehicle for change are these people who have lost their personality. In time, we shall be in a position to bestow on South Africa the greatest possible gift, a more human face," end quote. So pronounced Stephen Biko 4 decades ago in the heights of struggle. We see that more human face today in strong and vital institutions that serve as a bulwark against graft. We see it in communities transformed through the basic provision of housing, electricity, and health services. And we see it most essentially in the tens of thousands of young people in South Africa who have been able to take advantage of access to an education that throws open the world. However, that more human face is pulled on at the edges by crippling poverty and a persistent inequality that pose the greatest threats in the immediate and to the long-term stability of the country. The poverty rate hovers slightly above 50%. There are 7.5 million South Africans who are unemployed, 19 million adults in that remarkable republic without a matric or high school equivalency, and without growth, South Africa's social contract might unravel. Growth is currently less than 1%. Let's put that in perspective. In the period from 1994, after Nelson Mandela was sworn in, to today, the average growth rate in the country has been about 3.5%. In the 20 years before 1994, the growth rate was at 1.5%, and there were no real jobs grown in the economy from sometime in the mid-70s to 1994. So right now, today, South Africa is enduring growth rates that are on par with the height of the challenges during apartheid, during the height of the sanctions that were imposed on the country. That's a profound thing to have to wrap your brain around. The challenge is that while everyone wants growth, it isn't clear that everyone wants change. But we need to see some changes on the policy front to achieve inclusive growth that's urban, private sector driven, targets the information economy, and ultimately, of course, creates jobs. As you're well aware, the challenges in the economy, coupled with disgruntlement with service delivery at the district level and outrage at acts of corruption, produced municipal election results that have altered the political landscape in South Africa in key metros. The ANC suffered its worst results at the ballot box since apartheid. The decline to 54% share nationwide led to the losses of its control in Johannesburg, in Tshwane, and in Nelson Mandela Bay. The election also revealed an increased ANC dependence on rural voters at a time of steady urbanization and a reliance on the party's ability to push up its margins in the stronghold of KwaZulu-Natal. The resulting coalitions of opposition parties, most notably the seemingly incongruent pairing of the Democratic Alliance and the left-wing Economic Freedom Fighters, will bear close watching as South Africa lurches towards what will be a heavily contested national election in 2019. Some of us have often wondered whether or not the ANC could maintain its big tent of neoliberals and communists and Labor Party leaders and maintain one whole party. I marvel at how the coalition of the DA and the EFF will hold together for the next round of elections. Fascinating. For a political junkie like me, it's prime time. The municipal campaigns were litigated with a heavy infusion of racially charged rhetoric, and one suspects that might only increase when the stakes are as high as national control. Here, it is terribly important to note the role that instability on university campuses is also playing in the animation of the politics of the moment. The Fees Must Fall campaign has dominated social media and has been the central organizing principle for young intellectuals in the country. It's inspired older generations of South Africans who embrace it as the next logical iteration of the quest for equality, but it also has been disquieting in some spaces where violent disruption has been the default organizing tool. The direction of this movement is difficult to forecast, but as it makes common cause with the masses of young people on the margins of the economy who don't have a clear path to higher education, it has the potential to seed broader unrest or a more probing examination of the promise of opportunity 2 decades after Mandela's inauguration. Think about this, if you will, for a moment. South Africa has a population of 10.2 million young people between the ages of 15 and 24 years old. Of that 10.2 million, a full third are no longer in school, have never ever held a job, and have not received any vocational training. So when you look at the challenge on university campuses of young people who have some kind of pathway in education but are constrained by the inability to pay, and then the challenge of young folks who are on the outside looking in and don't see a way that they can be incorporated into the mainstream economy. You can see why there is tremendous concern amongst policy leaders, amongst business leaders, and civil society leaders in the country about what happens with that cohort, particularly absent growth. Any segue in this discussion from politics to the economy must pass through the surreal landscape of the somewhat bizarre intermittent threat of arrest hanging over the respected finance minister, Pravin Gordhan. It's kind of like the elephant in the room that you really got to talk about. This is a development that threatens to crowd out in-country discussions of some of the bold actions needed to strengthen the economy through the reform of institutions. South Africans are legitimately concerned about the health of state enterprises. They want to see that government tenders are not awarded to unqualified bidders with inside connections. They want to see that state-owned enterprises are run as businesses and not destructive personal fiefdoms. The steady drumbeat of major court rulings against government leaders and those running SOEs impacts South Africa's credit worthiness and attractiveness relative to other markets, which is why we would encourage South African leaders to stay on the tough path of reform spelt out in the latest budget, spelt out by Minister Gordhan, spelt out by President Zuma in a press conference that he had on September 16th with government, business, and labor leaders. As the U.S. considers a way forward with South Africa, understanding the potential power of South Africa's strengths and the causes of its weaknesses will be essential, right? We all know the saying that there's nothing wrong with South Africa that can't be repaired by all that's right in South Africa. And the country still really has an abundance of riches when you consider its physical infrastructure and when you consider the capacity of young people in that country who, when given the tools that they need, are able to outcompete and out-innovate anybody else on this planet. I have seen it time and time again. Let me share, if I could, a few statistics to back some of this up. Africa has about 1 billion people and an economy of $2.4 trillion. Just want to note, as President Obama did at the U.S.-Africa Business Forum, that despite the incredible progress that's been made in the last decade and a half or so, right now the entire GDP of the entire continent is still only the equivalent of the GDP of France. Really, really striking number there. South Africa's 55 million people, which represents 5.5% of the African population, contribute $360 billion economically. Foreign direct investment to Africa is about $55 billion per year, and South Africa garners about $7 billion of that, or roughly around 13%. South Africa's financial services sector, backed by a sound regulatory and legal framework, is sophisticated, boasting dozens of domestic and foreign institutions, providing a full range of services: commercial, retail, and merchant banking, mortgage lending, insurance, and investment. Simply put, Africa, again, cannot succeed without South Africa. That is not to say that South Africa's success will guarantee Africa's prosperity, but certainly seems to me like a necessary condition. And while I keep coming back to this because I just worry that too often my friends in Washington, D.C. are excited to talk about other pockets of activity and kinetic energy on the continent and don't spend enough time focused on what I see as just the critical and vital space that South Africa plays, both in the economy and for regional peace and security. That's why we prioritize our partnership with South Africa. President Obama has sought to transform the relationship between the U.S. and Africa to one of equal partners. He has said, "I see Africa as a fundamental part of our interconnected world, partners with America on behalf of the future we want for all of our children. That partnership must be grounded in mutual responsibility and mutual respect." And as you've heard the President say on many occasions, most recently last week at that business forum, South Africans and Africans are not looking for aid right now, but are looking for trade, economic development that will help nations to empower themselves. This absolutely holds true for South Africa in this moment and in what we like to call in our embassy our partnership for prosperity, acknowledging that in the 21st century we need to work together to further our mutual prosperity. I keep saying in conversations with policy leaders in South Africa that we're no longer in a space where despite the rhetoric in some quarters, we can build walls around our countries and put a moat and pull up the drawbridge. We are really dependent on success in Pretoria for success in Main Street in Cleveland, Ohio. Our trade volumes total about 21 billion per year in goods and services, about 300 billion rand. Our trading profile is balanced with imports and exports roughly equal and wide-ranging over hundreds of products. While other countries mainly purchase raw, unprocessed commodities, the U.S. buys cars, agro-processed lychees, and high-quality wines from South Africa. They're really good, too. Trade in services is also absolutely vibrant in tourism, in education, in technology. Services are the bedrock of both of our economies, and our trade in services is only going to grow stronger. And I hope, and I know, that my friends in South Africa in the disparate economic ministries will focus on the incredible strengths that South Africa has and will exploit those strengths as we look at regional trade facilitation across borders on the continent. Our profile supports vital industries in both countries, allowing regional value chains to thrive, provides good, high-paying jobs on both sides, and raises the standard of living in both countries. We're especially proud of the role that AGOA plays in South Africa. And I know that you're all familiar with the protracted negotiations we had to make certain that South Africa was included in the unprecedented 10-year renewal of AGOA, and we are pleased that we were able to settle the chicken wars in South Africa. AGOA is a uniquely American contribution to the development of the continent. It allows free access to our markets, making Africa a more competitive place to do business. As Minister of Trade and Industry Rob Davies has frequently pointed out, South Africa has made the best possible use of the tariff lines in AGOA, sending a wide variety of manufactured goods and high-value agricultural products to our country. We're working with South Africa right now, today, and we were just in conversations between our USTR and with Minister Davies 48 hours ago. But we're working with them now to add new products to their export basket and new producers of products to what they already export. And I'm really proud that as a result of our recent negotiations, we've been able to make an interesting shift with the importation of U.S. meats to South Africa to include those previously historically disadvantaged importers as a key to moving the product in the country. That's going to have a real impact on the ground in an industry that basically remains untransformed in the country. So this is absolutely critical. It's a moment where we use this one lever we had in our trade negotiations to foster real transformation. We're engaged with the South African government and private sector to define what our investment relationship will become after AGOA expires as we work together to create prosperity in our markets. We have to remember that 10 years will go by in a flash, and if we don't do the hard work now over the course of the next 3, 4, 5 years to design what the off-ramp will look like for AGOA, then we will have disadvantage both of our markets. Our robust trade relationship is founded on a strong bilateral investment partnership. For example, the Ford Motor Company is looking at more investment, more products, and more jobs in South Africa. It's investing $175 million right now, new investment, in the economy. The contributions of this iconic company, the contributions they've made since 2010 include the production of Rangers in Gauteng for export to over 148 markets and automotive parts in the Eastern Cape. And in April, Ford opened production lines for building the Everest sports utility vehicle in Pretoria. The new Everest program will supply cars throughout sub-Saharan Africa, enhancing South Africa's trade links with partners across the continent. Ford's investments, though, are measured more than in dollars spent. It's also measured by the number of jobs created, the skills and training provided to South African workers, the time Ford has spent developing suppliers and building up small enterprise, and the donations to education and community life. I am in the habit of really cheerleading and promoting the roughly 600 American companies that are invested in South Africa with an aggregate GDP of about 10% of the economy there. But I'm in the habit of promoting Ford and GE and IBM and Google, not just because they are managing, they're doing a good job of managing their bottom line in the country, but because they are contributing, again, to the project of transformation. It's absolutely exciting for me when I go out to a General Electric plant. I see the locomotives that GE is building in conjunction with young South Africans, and I see an incubator, an innovation incubator, where young South African engineers are studying, are learning, and are having skills transferred in a way that will allow them to be the industry leaders that the continent needs in the second half of the 21st century. That's why I am an unapologetic cheerleader for our companies in South Africa. So why are U.S. companies so eager to invest in the country? Mostly because it's the doorway to the rest of the continent. Creating opportunities in South Africa allows goods and services to flow into the African market, supplying millions of consumers with the products they need, whilst also helping African companies reach out to the rest of the world. While this trade and investment partnership has become a central feature, our relationship is based on a wide variety of shared interests as well. The U.S. and South Africa have a deep and broad relationship that goes well beyond the government conference rooms in Pretoria and touches people's lives in direct and profound ways. For instance, in the past few months, we've worked very closely with South African counterparts to support their response to the crippling drought in the region. This cooperation was seen in the coordination of humanitarian food shipments to South African ports and distributed regionally, seed bank and seed distribution projects to get farmers back on their feet and contributing to the regional food supply, and assistance on water quality, supply, and management. We're also partnering closely with South Africa to mitigate and adapt to the potentially severe impacts of climate change, so future droughts are less destructive and easier to manage. We collaborate closely on countering wildlife trafficking, assisting not only at the national level, but providing training, equipment, and cooperation to the provinces and individual wildlife parks. Poaching animals for horn and ivory is a multi-billion-dollar transnational criminal enterprise and a disturbing destruction not only to natural resources, but to the tourism economy nationally, to local and provincial governments, and destructive on the ability of communities to have real agency in their own fates. Our partnership with South Africa on the response to HIV and AIDS has been absolutely revolutionary, bipartisan, and unwavering. Through the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, the U.S. government has provided more than $5.1 billion to support South Africa in the last 12 years towards the eradication of HIV and AIDS. It's the largest health initiative ever enacted by one country to address a particular disease. Together, the U.S. and South Africa have been able to reduce HIV transmission and TB significantly over the past decade. But South Africa's young people are still at risk, especially its young women, who are up to 8 times more likely to be HIV positive than young men of their same age cohort. Through our newly launched DREAMS initiative, we're now focusing more on the social drivers that continue to make young women vulnerable to HIV. When you consider that this week alone, there'll be 2,400 new HIV transmissions amongst young women in South Africa. You understand what impact that has on social development, the economic impact that it has on lives that are marginalized, lives that are ultimately lost, and the impact that it has on governments that need to continue to invest to put upwards of 6 million people on antiretrovirals. It's just not sustainable if we don't do something to curb the curve of new transmissions, and I'm proud of the new program that we've built and designed with young South African women themselves serving at the forefront, serving as ambassadors in this program and taking real leadership over their lives. I could go on and on and on all day around our areas of cooperation. In the energy sector, we're working with South African partners on practical and technical steps to help alleviate shortages so we don't have the kind of rolling blackouts that we had in South Africa 2 years ago. A very brief anecdote. There is a neighborhood in Johannesburg, a revitalized neighborhood called Maboneng, where a lot of my young hipster friends hang out. And my daughter, in particular, was fond of dragging me to Maboneng to go to her favorite South African dressmaker in the community. And I remember last year during the blackouts, going out to Maboneng, going to visit with this young dressmaker. We went to her shop. The lights were completely non-existent. She was sitting in the dark by herself, and the 4 women who she always had working with her on the sewing machines were nowhere to be seen. And I asked what was going on. She said, well, we're having rolling blackouts, so I had to let go of these 4 women. So when I think about that impact and you multiply it across communities, you understand why our ability to have reliable sources of energy, of electricity in these communities will make all the difference in the world to engendering the kind of growth rates that South Africa needs to continue to employ people and make social progress. So I could go on. I could talk to you about the partnerships in the energy sector. I could talk about what we're doing in law enforcement, what we're doing with South Africans in education and literacy. But you would quickly grow bored. Suffices to say that irrespective of the challenges that exist sometimes in the government-to-government relationships, we managed to work through those challenges to make progress. And I am keen to note to all of you that there was a Pew Research study a few short years ago that showed that roughly 77% of South Africans have a positive view of the relationship with the United States. That's important to note and to remember when you look at some of the headlines about some of the challenges and the tensions that can sometimes crop up and some of the interesting accusations that come from some quarters around our intent. So despite the challenges I described, you can see there are a number of vital areas where we're working together for mutual prosperity and where we're making real gains. But I also know we can do better and we can do more. We can do a lot more. AGOA is an essential element of our trade relationship, but it can only achieve but so much. The U.S. sees the need for a mature, balanced, and mutually beneficial trade relationship, and from recent talks with DTI, we're confident that South Africa sees the need as well. We do all agree on the goal, a South Africa that's inclusive, transformative, and with a strong economy that ensures prosperity for all, a broadly shared prosperity. While the bulk of the work has to be done domestically, external actors, such as the individuals who are in the room today, have to have a seat at the table as well. To do this, we need to find a way to bury suspicions of the past, to build trust that will allow us to work as partners, and of course, this will secure the bright future that young people aspire to. Our partnership for prosperity is inclusive of all areas of cooperation and useful as a platform to spur economic growth. This partnership will lead to job creation, increased bilateral investment, more energy production, greener energy jobs, and more efficient healthcare programs. Ideally, we would be able to wrap all of our shared concerns into an economic partnership agreement. But those who've worked in Washington, on Capitol Hill, or those who've been in diplomacy know that it takes an incredibly long time to work through the simplest things, let alone complex and complicated trade negotiations. What I'd like to propose in the shorter term is a series of smaller agreements that set out our sectors of cooperation and outline reasonable, achievable goals for moving forward together. These smaller agreements would focus on a range of topics important to both sides. Interests like protecting and using intellectual property, protecting labor rights, trade facilitation, bilateral investment issues, and fostering trade in services. In my mind, we'd work on each agreement separately, figuring out the best ways to collaborate and address concerns to make those agreements absolutely transparent and mutually beneficial. And while separate, these agreements would all be building towards the ultimate goal in our partnership. I'd like to call our joint efforts to finalize the group of agreements a strategic economic partnership, or a STEP, only because we just don't have enough acronyms in Washington, D.C. That name has a little bit of cachet to it, since these small agreements would be steps made by our governments with the strategic objective of building a more robust partnership. For this to work, we're going to need a groundswell of support. We need your support. Companies need to engage with both governments and advocate for more transparent regulations, more clear policies, and commitments to developing these agreements. I was having a conversation with executives from Caterpillar just last week, and they've been on the cusp of signing an agreement in South Africa, but it's been delayed because of the moving goals around the BBBEE policies in the country. I've had conversations with other executives who are looking to move electrical products into the country, things that require a plug, and because of new regulations, we've gone from 30-day approvals for those products to move in to 500 days. And of course, that means that companies and products just have to go searching in other markets, which again is not good and helpful ultimately for South Africa and its growth. In closing, I want to refer yet again to the press conference that President Zuma had, I guess it's 2 weeks ago now, around September 16th. In that press conference, President Zuma, again, where he convened business, labor, and government leaders, President Zuma ticked off a number of key priorities to help transform the investment environment in South Africa and push up growth. And I was struck by one of the points that the president made, or one of the agenda items that he lifted up. The president suggested that in order for progress to be made, a youth employment program that will aim to place 1 million young people in paid internships in the private sector over a 3-year period, with the cost to be borne by the private sector and supported by a negotiated package of government incentives would be needed. I was struck by that in so many ways. I think, of course, that President Zuma is spot on the need to develop opportunity for young people in the country, but I was also struck by, and I know my friends in South African government won't mind my saying this, but I was struck by the lack of detail around the plan at this point in crisis. I was struck by what seems to me an inability to have a proper conversation about the alignment of skills that actually exist amongst young people in the country, the kind of training that could and should be made available, and the jobs that are still yet going wanting in so many countries, so many companies in the country. There's a lack of alignment there, a lack of a thread that runs through all of that, that really needs to be examined and tossed over. And there really has to be an MRI performed around these training programs and opportunities for young people. I've gone through the percentages with you. I've gone through the numbers. I will tell you that when I talk to young people in our Mandela Washington program, when I talk to the young women who are our dreams ambassadors, when they tell me that they are the generation of leaders that the country has been looking for and waiting for, I couldn't agree with them more. But I have to say to all of you today that I am, while I remain wildly optimistic about the ability of our friends to get it right, I share just some real anxiety about what things look like over the course of the next few years. But since I am in DC on the occasion of the opening of the new African American Museum, which I toured a few days ago, I have to be reminded of our own challenges here at home, the ways that we've managed to work through them on the economic front and on the pursuit for equal access. And that just gives me a particular confidence that we'll all get there together. So thank you so very much for enduring my rambles this morning.
The ambassadors agreed to take a few questions. We'll do about 10 minutes or so. Really, that was excellent presentation. It was Beyonce. And I think just reflects how multifaceted the U.S. relationship with South Africa is. And I think there's not always appreciation for that.
Thank you so very much, Jennifer. And thank you, Jennifer. As we take questions from the audience, I just want to quickly introduce the brain trust of our embassy, Mr. Laird Schreiber, who's our economic counsel. I don't know where Laird is. There's Laird. Laird does all the hard work that I'd love to take credit for, and I hope that he might even jump in on some of the Q&A if there's a point that he'd like to make.
Okay, fantastic. So why don't we open up the floor for questions at this point? Yes, we'll go to you first. Please wait for the mic and introduce yourself and your affiliation.
Hi, I'm Brad Gutierrez, no real official affiliation. I'm curious if you could comment on the role and the success or lack thereof of Mbeki's Black Empowerment Program, and what has that meant for economic development within South Africa?
We're going to do 3 at a time and then come back. Yes, the gentleman there.
Thank you. I'm Dani Bjekman. I'm with C&M International, an advisory firm here in Washington, but more recently was New Zealand's Deputy Ambassador in South Africa. Ambassador, anyone living in Washington will understand the reality, as you've outlined today too, that getting American companies involved in putting their shoulder to the wheel is much easier when something is going wrong. Like the chicken wars, getting American companies involved there was very easy. I'm interested in your thoughts on what more we can all do to push American businesses to get involved in South Africa, and also in pushing the AGOA relationship and thinking about the eventual off-ramp, but thinking more positively rather than thinking about it in terms of building things rather than fighting things that are going wrong, or fighting trade facilitation problems and market access issues.
Great. And yes, the gentleman there.
My name is Yaya Fanusi. I'm with United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force LLC. You said South African, let me state this. South Africa needs the rest of Africa more for exponential economic growth than the rest of Africa needs South Africa.
No, I didn't.
I'm not going to argue with you. You don't know. I'm not going to argue with you.
Pardon? I beg your pardon?
No, you were saying no. I said I'm not going to argue with you.
No, I didn't.
Okay, well, maybe he can
I was telling you what I said about your comment.
Oh, okay. You weren't quoting him. You were saying.
Can we give him the microphone?
Yeah, why don't we
back?
go?
I was saying, you said that the growth in South Africa will create growth in the rest of Africa. In a nutshell, that's what you said. Yeah. I'm saying it's the other way around. South Africa needs the rest of Africa more.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we can reply to those 3, or we can take I know there's some more hands.
One more.
Let's take one more. Peter Leon. Okay, we'll come back to you. Yeah.
Ted Pacombe from Brookings. My question has to do with a country that did not get mentioned at all, China. And China is the #1 big actor economically in South Africa. Can you say a bit more about its role there, including its impact on South Africa's foreign policy more generally, particularly on issues that we're concerned about on democracy and human rights?
And maybe I can add to that, Russia.
They've been in the news of late, haven't they?
And the BRICS generally, perhaps.
Sure,
But
sure. Amongst South African policymakers, amongst those who are looking to make investments in the country, that the policy itself continues to be a moving target. Every legislative cycle, every new parliament, it seems as if there are more trappings, more ornaments being put. Should I switch to that? Oh, sorry. It feels as if there are more ornaments being put on the Christmas tree of BBBEE, which makes it very, very, very difficult to accurately predict the course of one's investments, particularly when some onerous ownership percentages are being imposed on certain industries. For instance, we've been locked in real tough struggle in the security industry with regs that were being imposed on over 51% ownership by South Africans. So again, there have been a number of industry leaders that have emerged because of BBBEE, and it's probably put an effective downward pressure throughout the corporate structures of South Africa to promote black leadership, but it really has not led to the kind of broad economic growth and shared involvement in the economy that was hoped for, and which is why there are constant calls, both in government and in civil society and economic actors in the country, to reform the BBB codes and to improve scoring for companies that are investing instead on skills transference. If I'm a South African policymaker right now, I'm pretty darn interested in any company that's going to come to the country and help reorient the supply chain, create small businesses and entrepreneurs all up and down the supply chain, right? If you look at the U.S. and the story of the recovery from the Great Recession from 2008 to 2009, one of the remarkable things to look at is what happened following the bailout of the auto industry, and how that had an impact all up and down the Rust Belt on smaller businesses that were able to bring on newer and newer employees and enhance their skill sets to train them for the next challenges in the economy. South Africa really needs companies that are going to be coming and investing in the transfer of those kinds of skills, the GEs, the work that Ford is doing in its Silverton plant. Laird will tell you, I make any excuse to go visit the Silverton plant of Ford because I know that when I walk through those doors, I'm not going to meet Americans who are running the business. I'm meeting South Africans, young South Africans, and interestingly enough, many young black South African women who are on the assembly line, who are moving into management positions, who eventually are going to take those skills, they'll leave Ford, they'll start their own enterprises, and that's going to lead to really thriving community. I think that's much more important than the emphasis that's been placed in the scoring over BBBEE in years past, and I hope that there's an increasing awareness of that throughout South African government and industry. On your question about American companies and what I think they could and should be doing to build instead of gripe, I would look at two categories. One, companies that are already in place in the country, and two, companies that have not yet invested in Africa, who are curious about it, but who are intimidated by what they read in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Economist about the numerous challenges. We find that whenever executives actually come into the country, kick the tires, look under the hood, they find that there's a more friendly environment there, a more accessible environment that has the regulatory framework that they're looking for, that has systems that are immediately recognizable to them, that will enable them to operate and to grow their investment. They'll also find a workforce that's eager to engage. So I'm always doing all that I can to invite more and more American companies to come and to take the car out for a spin. On companies that are already in country, I am incredibly proud of the dynamic American Chamber of Commerce that we have that's in Johannesburg. It is, as you noted, quick to react whenever there are challenges, but increasingly I'm finding that group of leading businesses to take the kind of proactive steps that I think you're advocating. I think it was about 6 months ago when a cluster of AmCham companies announced a new entrepreneurship fund that they're starting to invest in young businesses, developing entrepreneurs in the country. And I'm hoping that that's going to be added to their scoring as well with government. But I do wish that we could get into a space where we were less reactive to legislation that's being promulgated by Parliament that we find to be regressive, and more in a space where we're actually proposing what we think would be regulatory regimes that would be more conducive to growth. We have many wonderful examples from other part of the continent where we've managed to do just that kind of thought work. And it would be wonderful if we could cross-pollinate some of that in South Africa as well. I also think and I want to be careful how I say this as someone in government. I'm always careful about lecturing my friends in the private sector, but it would be wonderful if sometimes we would set aside some of our immediate, narrow, parochial, competitive instincts and work across companies with shared interests in areas where we think more growth is possible, and in spaces where we think that South Africans have wonderful resources, some creative and innovative policymakers who just need us to lean in a little bit more on an open door. For instance, I think that South Africa has been at the cutting edge on renewable energy policy. Unfortunately, there were some announcements made in ESCOM lately that seem to set some of that back a bit. And I think there's an opportunity for American voices to collectively lean in and sound off on what's possible in that sector. And I think there are enough reform actors that to partner with and work with. There's something else that I want to note for what I think American companies could and should be doing that I didn't mention in my remarks. Because of the creativity of Laird and his econ team and our foreign commercial service team at Post, we've put a real emphasis on work at the subnational level. There are some real challenges in the work that we do government to government at the national level. But if you look at government in Johannesburg, in Tshwane, down in the Cape, or in the Bay, you will find some relatively young leaders in government who have an appetite for innovation, who don't believe that their ideas are the only good ideas that exist, and who are eager and really hungry for corporate partnership. We've been able to make some really great marriages between some of our leading firms and leaders at the municipal level who are looking for some help in healthcare, in IT, in energy metrics, and it's really made a difference on the ground for constituencies and for politicians who are immediately accountable at the ballot box. So we want to really stress that our company should be proactively looking for those opportunities at the subnational level. And on your point, sir, my apologies, my sincere apologies for having cut you off. That was rude of me. I misunderstood the point that you were making, but I would actually be quick to agree that South Africa can absolutely benefit from growth in other regions of Africa, and I think should be taking advantage of the service sector skills that its population has, and I think it doesn't exploit that to the ability to the extent that it could. I certainly know that as we train more healthcare workers, more middle managers in the rest of the subcontinent, that's going to have a positive impact on South Africa as well. And all of us should be really encouraging our friends on the continent to complete the terms around the tripartite trade arrangement, for instance.
And then you got the China question.
Oh, China. I was avoiding that one. Darn, you caught me. Laird, I'd love it if you'd jump in on this. I think that from thousands of miles away, one may have a skewed sense of the day-to-day importance of the relationship with China, Russia, and the BRICS configuration writ large. China, obviously, a very active presence on the continent right now. It's incredible that there are now 1 million Chinese expats that are living permanently in sub-Saharan Africa. That's got an interesting impact on the economy, on the culture, on the politics. To the question of whether or not we're seeing some kind of impact on human rights and open governance as a result of that relationship, I wouldn't say that we are. I think that South Africa and South Africans are just right to continue to be proud of the protections that they've put in place for their strong legal framework, for the reverence that they have for their constitution, and for the really robust civil society and annoyingly free media that's in the country. These are all great things that South Africans continue to lean on, promote, protect, and burnish. I think, as President Obama said, that the increased presence of China in South Africa and elsewhere is a good thing for South Africa. It's a good thing for our partners in Africa. It's a good thing as long as South Africans are asking the Chinese the same tough questions that they've always asked the U.S. government and our companies as well about what outcome looks like for the average South African. I'm just so proud that last year alone, we imported over 65,000 vehicles from South Africa that were built in South Africa by South African hands and finished in South Africa into the U.S. We are not just going in and gaining raw commodities where we finish the work at home, but we're helping to really build the industry on the continent. And I hope that my friends in South Africa are making the same insistent demands on the Chinese that they're making on us, as they well should. I think it was, and Laird, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was about 8 months ago now that there was an interesting article in, I want to say it was in Business Day, that laid out that GE has fulfilled its obligation to develop and build locomotives with South Africa, in South Africa and in Pennsylvania, using South African materials, South African know-how, and growing South African jobs. That same article noted that the Chinese partner that was selected as the other builder of locomotives was way behind on the question of localization. So I hope my South African friends will note that and keep the pressure on.
We are a bit over time. If we can, no, it's being great. If we maybe take, okay, three quick questions. Peter Leon, Tony, Pauline.
Yeah. I'll make it very brief.
Okay, well, if we make them quick and the answers quick, we can squeeze in four.
I was very interested in your comment about protectionism in South Africa. You talked about the 30-day period moving to 500 in terms of specification inspections. I know that's been a big issue for the EU as well. But I just wanted to ask you a question, because you actually answered it partly in answer to one of the questions about the Private Security Industry Regulation Amendment Bill, which will effectively indigenize South African private security by requiring 50% South African ownerships, not black empowerment related, as a requirement for security companies operating in the country. Obviously that's a breach of the General Agreement on Trade and Services, because it's discriminatory. But the issue I'm really asking you about is the fact ADT have now effectively disinvested, I understand, partly as a result of that, the respect to that legislation, because President Zuma has never signed it into law. The bill was brought out in 2012, passed by Parliament in 2014. It sat on his desk now for 2.5 years. But, the answer is either to send it to the Constitutional Court, withdraw it, or send it back to Parliament. But he's done none of those things. I'd just like to get your view on that.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm a senior associate here at CSIS, Tony Carroll, and I was the guest of your consulates in Durban and Johannesburg in August on a series of speeches regarding AGOA and building an innovation economy. I wrote a long op-ed in the newspaper about that. South Africa far and away is the most economically complex and most innovative economy in Africa. It can be a platform to spread that, throughout Africa, take advantage of that innovation. However, recently there's been tabled introduction to a review of IPR laws, which many fear will constrain the opportunities that South Africa has to take advantage of both its economic complexity and its innovation, which we'd like to get your comment on. Maybe that's something Laird might want to jump in on. And Pauline is one of our great mentors. I came to South Washington in 1986, and Pauline ran for years the most active group on South Africa in Washington. I'm honored to have you follow.
Thank you, Tony. I'm Pauline Baker. I'm with the Fund for Peace, and I've been following South Africa for quite a long time. It's very, very heartening to hear all the progress. Our press is usually focused on the negative, but I'd like you to address one foreign policy issue for South Africa and for the United States, which is getting too little attention, and that's Zimbabwe. There is a big Zimbabwe population in South Africa, so it's a domestic issue as well as a foreign policy issue. And clearly, there is a trajectory that's going to lead to some sort of crisis when Mugabe leaves. How is South Africa looking at that issue, and what are we doing in terms of working with South Africa to prepare for something that could end up with violence and impact South Africa very, very significantly? Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. So what I'll do, if I could, I saw, David, your hand up for a really long time, and we skipped you. So we'll take your question, and then I will, because Laird is in the habit of answering more succinctly than I do quite often, I'm going to ask him to jump in on the private security question and the latest with that legislation and where it stands on the president's desk. And on IPR, and then I'll jump in on Zim and whatever question David has.
Thank you for including me.
We miss you.
David Smith of The Guardian. I just wondered if you could tell us about the health of the diplomatic relationship, given the sort of strange incident earlier this year when there was some mutterings about the US wanting regime change, and you responded on Twitter. What was the fallout from that?
Do you want to jump in on IPR and the private security bill?
And we will have a panel on kind of the economic and investment climate, of which those are part as well. But
well, I guess very quickly on the private security bill, I think this is something that industry in general, and certainly the security industry, has been quite clear about its views. It's an interesting choice of verb, indigenize, versus another candidate that's been used is expropriate. And I think the basic point is industry's made it really quite clear its view that this would be a very negative signal, not just for the private security sector, but for other sectors as well. I think there is, in general, amongst industry, and certainly in the security industry, there's no question about agreement on the need for transformation and capacity development, technology transfer, things like that. It was a question of how do you get there. And so, kind of the one pen change in ownership is indeed the kind of thing that would undermine South Africa's commitment, not only under GATT, but also, I think, in terms of just creating the right kind of investment climate. We remain concerned about it. We're certainly watching it, but I think, as you very aptly put it, as far as we understand, it remains on the president's desk. So we'll have to see what he does. On IPR in general, I think we're very happy.
Can I just say that this is one instance where we partnered effectively with our European friends in the diplomatic corps and had some very, very aggressive pushback on the Private Security Act. And I think that if not for our constant agitation on this, that some version of that bill would have already been signed, sealed, and delivered.
So just very quickly on IPR, we see enormous potential in South Africa's information economy, both to generate long-term growth as well as for really sustained job creation. And that's both in kind of the copyright sort of sectors, and that's anything connected to the internet, both using as a platform as well as really opening up a lot of services. Certainly in the rest of the knowledge economy basis, the kind of the patent-related industries, we see huge potential for the pharmaceutical and the broader health sector, as well as some advanced manufacturing materials. South Africa has a pretty good system right now, but this is something where the government in the last 2 years has been looking at a number of conditions related to the investment climate. They're currently undergoing a review as to what kind of rules should govern, as it's basically rewriting its patent system. And so this is something where I think, frankly, we as a government will be pressing for something that makes offers very clear, sensible guidelines for investors, both South African and foreign, so they know basically what the rules of the road might be. But I think, in general, this is an area where South Africa can really burnish its competitiveness as it competes with other advanced countries around the world. Getting it right will be a real driver. Getting it wrong will choke off some opportunity. This is one area, perhaps getting back to Danny's point, what can companies do? This is something where I think companies here in Washington, working through CSIS and other organizations, as well as companies in South Africa, offering their opinions on the actual details to the South African government would be very helpful. The time is now to offer that kind of input.
And I would just quickly add that probably the most contested space in IPR is around pharmaceuticals. And I've suggested to Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa and the Health Ministry that it might make sense sooner rather than later for us to convene a discourse between our mission, those ministries, and some of the leaders in the pharmaceutical industry, so we can get ahead of the challenges. It's going to take an incredible amount of difficult diplomacy. Speaking of diplomacy, it's so hard in the time allotted here to give you a proper response on Zimbabwe. I will, but first, quickly thank you for the work that you did in the 80s around South Africa. It was needed and should continue to be appreciated. Zim is a special and unique challenge for South Africa, whenever there's pronounced turbulence in Zimbabwe, it has a clear impact on migrant flows and creates real challenges in some of the townships. There's a recognition, there's an articulated recognition from President Zuma and others in the government that they need to work with Robert Mugabe's administration and with forces in the opposition to make determinations about what a peaceful transition will look like. Our embassies, both in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, and our leadership in the State Department have been in regular communication with our South African counterparts on this issue, and I'd welcome an opportunity to have real detailed follow up with you on this question. You can imagine that there are some parts of this that are difficult to litigate in this kind of a forum, but I'd love to do a deeper dive with you on it. To David's question, I think that you're right that we did have a little bit of fun on social media. It's always great when you can employ an Oprah Winfrey meme, as I did in that period. But I'll say that one should recognize that there's quite a difference between rhetoric used by a party official at a rally versus the kind of thoughtful engagement and partnership we receive from DIRCO, from the presidency, from senior members of parliament and ministries. We continue to work effectively across the board in health, in science and technology, in education, with Minister Gordon and others who care about economic transformation, and the exchanges that we had in that heightened period have had absolutely no impact. I will say that, and I think it's important to say this as an American diplomat whose family is from Haiti and who was born in the Congo during the period of, let's call it, transition from Lumumba to Mobutu Sese Seko. I can understand what some of the historic suspicion is when senior member of the ANC comes out in public and casts aspersions on our intent and questions every bit of engagement that we have with young people in the country. I understand the Cold War history better than most do, and can be open at discussing some of the shortcomings of the past. And as somebody who was a demonstrator with the body of young people being arrested in front of the South African embassy in the run-up to sanctions, I can appreciate why some look at the U.S. and think you were on the wrong side of history in that moment, and might continue to mean us harm. So I get all of that, but I also know, as I noted before, that there is wide approval amongst average South Africans towards U.S. policy in the country, and more urgently, there are millions of young people in South Africa who will directly benefit from all that we can bring in the economy, in education, in health. And I hope that while South African government officials continue to ask really, really tough questions about the partnership, that they still lean in and take advantage of the goodwill that we have and the growing recognition in Ohio, in Florida, in California and New York, that positive outcomes in South Africa accrue to the benefit of Americans.
Listen, I've done a terrible job as a timekeeper, but it was well worth it. Really, that was a phenomenal opportunity to engage on that whole range of issues. I want to say thank you so much. We would love to have you back in future as well, and we'll continue to follow. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Gaspard.